Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into some really complex ancient texts. Specifically, we're looking at prophecies about the Great Tribulation, a predicted time of pretty intense global chaos. Our goal is to sort of unpack the timing of key events mentioned, like the abomination of desolation and the first resurrection. And we'll see how just small differences in reading certain phrases can totally change the picture of what might happen.
Exactly. We're mainly drawing from the book of Daniel and also 2 Thessalonians, foundational texts for this. And we're focusing on this specific wording that scholars debate when figuring out when this Great Tribulation actually starts and ends for believers. Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy is kind of central here, especially that final week.
Okay, right. So let's start unpacking that. We've got this abomination of desolation and this figure, the son of destruction. You see them mentioned in Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. They're basically prophesied to do something extremely blasphemous in a holy place. And that act, that's supposed to be the signal for the start of this terrible Great Tribulation. A real line in the sand, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting is how that act, the abomination, connects directly to Daniel's timeline, specifically how it relates to that last week we mentioned. And within that week, the absolute key reference point is this phrase, half of the week.
Half of the week, okay.
Yeah. How you interpret that phrase kind of shifts the whole timeline.
And this tribulation itself.
Yeah.
It's depicted pretty graphically, right? Intense suffering.
Oh, absolutely. The sources talk about first a quarter of humanity dying, then even a third. Widespread martyrdom of saints, huge earthquakes, and this forced beast worship for 42 months, linked to the sixth sense mark.
Yeah.
And as you said, the abomination event is what kicks it all off. That's the trigger.
The trigger. So the big question then becomes, when does this tribulation start relative to that half of the week point? Especially if, as some views hold, the first resurrection happens right at that midpoint.
Precisely. That's the core issue. When does the tribulation for believers happen in relation to that midpoint?
Right. And this is where those different interpretations of half of the week really come into play, isn't it? It seems crucial. What are the main viewpoints?
Well, yeah, there are basically 2 main ways people read it. Let's call the first one view 1. This view sees half of the week as meaning during that period. So the idea is the son of destruction enforces this beast worship, and the tribulation for saints happens during the first 42 months of that final 7-year week.
Okay, during the first half.
Right, and you see support for this in how many translations phrase it, JPS, BBB, ESV. They often use 4/2 or similar wording. So in this view, that blessed event, Daniel mentions 1,335 days after the abomination, that would likely be the first resurrection itself, happening near the end of those first 42 months.
So a longer period of tribulation before the resurrection. That makes sense with that reading. What about the other view, view 2?
View 2 interprets half of the week, much more precisely, like at the exact midpoint. So the son of destruction appears and acts right at the 3.5-year mark of the final week. Now, if the first resurrection happens immediately or very soon after that midpoint event,
then the tribulation period for saints could be really short, maybe just days.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Very short. And under this interpretation, that blessed event at 1,335 days wouldn't be the resurrection. It would more likely mark the beginning of the 1,000-year kingdom that's prophesied.
Okay, that's a very different outcome. But it brings up another point mentioned in the sources. What if saints are still on earth after the first resurrection? Or what if the beast worship thing keeps going into the second half of the week? How do these views handle that?
Yeah, good question. The source material actually pushes back on those ideas pretty strongly. The understanding often is that the first resurrection is, well, singular. It gathers all the saints at once. So the implication is none would be left behind to face more tribulation.
Okay, so a clean break, sort of.
Kind of. And also, the prophecies describe really severe plagues hitting the earth after the first resurrection, which would make it pretty difficult, you'd think, to maintain some kind of globally enforced system of worship. The chaos would be immense.
Right, that makes sense. So if we try to synthesize this, regardless of whether the tribulation starts during the first half or right at the midpoint, what's the endpoint look like according to Daniel?
Well, Daniel gives those specific day counts, 1,290 days and 1,335 days after the abomination. It says the person who reaches 1,335 days is blessed. The common interpretation is that this marks the end of the Great Tribulation for the saints. They're caught up, resurrected. And that's when the judgments really begin for the remaining beast forces.
So it seems like our deep dive today really highlights how much rests on interpreting just a few key phrases like half of the week. It's not just the events themselves, but pinning down that timing that leads to very different pictures.
Absolutely. It really underscores the complexities. And, it leads to a good question for you listening in. How does seeing these different scholarly takes on prophecies like this make you think about interpreting difficult texts in general? Does it challenge any assumptions? And maybe, what new questions does it make you ask about how future events might unfold or how prophecy even works? Something to ponder.